All right, welcome to week 2, everybody. This week we're going to be jumping into philosophy, the philosophical foundations of moral reasoning and ethics. Later on in the semester, we'll get involved with some more contemporary theories of business ethics, but really a lot of these are all grounded in these ancient philosophical systems of ethics. And so we're going to start here as kind of our foundation for the semester. Today, we're going to be talking about utilitarianism. But before we get to that, it's important to note that when we talk about philosophical frameworks for ethics, there's largely two groups that most frameworks fall into. The first is teleology, and the second is deontology. Now, you'll have some scholars that'll debate, philosophers that'll debate whether or not certain frameworks fall outside of these two, but generally, most frameworks are one or the other of these two categories. So on the one hand, you have teleology. This derives from the Greek telos, meaning goal directed. So in Greek, your telos is the end goal, your potential, where the destination that you're headed towards. And in this framework of ethics, it treats the outcome as what determines the value of the act. So it's looking forward to the ends of an action to be able to determine its value. On the other hand, you have deontology. This derives from Greek deon, meaning duty, and logos, meaning logic. So in other words, it's principle based and it looks at the value in the act itself. So rather than looking towards the ends, it focuses on the means to achieve those ends and suggests that there are principles that guide which actions we take to get the ends that we seek. That's going to matter in how we determine what is right and wrong. What we're focusing on today is teleology. So we'll get to deontology later in this week, but today we're focusing on teleology and one specific form of it, which is called consequentialism. So broadly, consequentialism is whether an act is morally right, depends only on the consequences of that act. So instead of determining the circumstances or the nature of the act itself or any principles or facts that precede the act, regardless of all of that, consequentialism looks at the consequences of that action to be able to determine whether or not it was the right action. Now, over time, a lot of different flavors of consequentialism have developed. You can see here that people started to disagree and add more nuance to what kind of consequences we're talking about. So are we talking about the actual consequences of the action or the perceived consequences of the action? Are we talking about direct consequences or indirect consequences? Are we talking about the results of those consequences? Are we talking about how we value those consequences? So I won't go through all of these, but you can see there's a whole bunch of different flavors of consequentialism that have developed over time. Utilitarianism is one of these flavors of consequentialism. So when we talk about utilitarianism, it's a very specific, probably the most popular form of consequentialism. It's important to remember, one, that it's a consequentialist theory, and two, that it's teleological. Okay, so those are the two important things to remember about utilitarianism before we begin. So we already know that utilitarianism is going to look at the consequences of the actions and focus on the ends that we're trying to achieve rather than the value of the act itself. So to understand utilitarianism, we have to start with a philosopher named Jeremy Bentham. So he was an English philosopher, was absolutely brilliant, was a genius, graduated from Oxford as a teenager, was playing sonatas on the violin at like 7 years old, was just a child prodigy. And he was determined to make a more practical and quantitative approach to determining ethical action. And he believed that you could take the consequences of any action and weigh the benefits versus the consequences of that action and how it affects the majority of the people before even deciding which choice to make. So how do you make this determination? How do you weigh the consequences of your actions? Well, he said this: nature has placed us under the governance of two sovereign masters, pain and pleasure. So this goes all the way back to a form of Greek philosophy called Epicureanism. Epicurean was kind of one of the first ones to talk about what's called hedonism, which is which is essentially pleasure seeking. It's the endeavor to pursue physical pleasure and avoid physical pain. So Bentham is hearkening all the way back to the Greek philosophy of hedonism to say, how are we going to weigh the consequences of our actions? Well, it comes down to pleasure and pain. And then the second part of his theory that he brings to bear here is called the principle of utility. And this has become kind of the defining factor, the defining principle of utilitarianism, that it's about doing the greatest good for the greatest number. So these two principles work together to define utilitarianism. One, we're going to be weighing pleasure versus pain to trying to determine the level of happiness from the outcome. And two, we're going to try to maximize that pleasure and pain for as many people as we can. And so this resulted in what became called the hedonic calculus. So again, he's wanting to make just a quantitative calculation of what is right. So under this system, an act is right if it brings the most happiness. And happiness is calculated by weighing the associated pleasure and pain. So it's as simple as this formula here. Happiness equals the amount of pleasure minus the pain. So net pleasure is how he considered happiness. Now, it's not quite as simple as this formula that we have here. He came up with 7 criteria by which he would weigh the pleasure and the pain in any given situation. So you can see here he considered intensity. How intense is the pleasure or pain? Its duration, how long does it last? Certainty, is it likely or probable that this pleasure or pain will occur? Propinquity, how far off in the future it is. Does it happen right now, or is it going to be far distant? Fecundity, what is the probability that the pleasure will lead to other pleasures? Purity, what's the probability that the pain will lead to other pains? And then the extent, how many persons are affected by the pleasure? So there's a little bit more to this hedonic calculus in weighing all of these different factors, but it's important to understand that Bentham believed that this could be literally a quantitative experience, that using like a balanced scale, you can weigh the pleasures and the pains using these criteria and determine an outcome that's quantitative in nature. Now, the second philosopher we're going to talk about is John Stuart Mill. So interestingly enough, he was Bentham's godson. And so he came a little bit later, and he built off of Bentham's theory. He generally agreed with Bentham that a person's well-being is of the highest importance, but he disagreed that happiness and pleasure are the same thing. And so what he really sought to do was to add a qualitative portion to the quantitative aspects of utilitarianism. So he was generally down with Bentham's quantitative measurement, but he says, you know what, it's not that easy. Not all pleasures are the same. And so we need to add kind of a qualitative aspect to this. What is pleasure, and how do humans experience pleasure? So he determined a system of higher and lower pleasures. And he believed that pleasures of the intellect that humans can experience are higher than pleasures of the body. So, for example, a single wealthy individual might seek pleasure from drugs, alcohol, and an active sex life with many partners, but lack the happiness of true friendship and love of family. Again, these are things that strike at what it means to be human. And so he believed that the basest pleasures or satisfactions were not the same as what it meant to experience enduring happiness as a human being. And so this led to what was probably his most famous statement. It is better to be a human being dissatisfied than a pig satisfied. Better to be Socrates dissatisfied than a fool satisfied. So you can see here where he's trying to pick up on human nature and the qualitative experience of existence for human beings. So he's saying here literally that the most dissatisfied human that exists on the face of the earth is better off than the most satisfied pig, right? Because a human can experience pleasures and the happiness of the intellect that are of a higher experience that a pig can't even experience, no matter how satisfied they are. A pig or just mere animals are only able to experience satisfaction and instinct fulfillment, whereas humans are able to experience much higher forms, in his opinion, of happiness. So in summary, he's similar to Bentham in saying, yes, we're going to weigh happiness. We want to determine, using the consequences, how much happiness comes for as many people as possible. So John Stuart Mill also subscribed to the utility principle, that we want to maximize happiness for as many people as possible. But he sought to add just a little bit more nuance to it and say, you know what, not all pleasures are equal. And so sometimes we have to be able to distinguish between what kind of pleasures we're talking about when we're weighing and making this calculus decision in our minds. So as we look at utilitarianism, as we consider this theory, there are some issues and some criticisms of utilitarianism. It sounds pretty good to say we want to do the most good for the most people. So going back to the example we used in the very first class with the trolley problem, a lot of you, as you were discussing why you would pull the lever and allow one person to be killed instead of 5, is you use this same calculation. 5 people die or 1 people die. I'm going to choose 1, right? That would create the greatest good for the greatest number of people. That's a very simple way to make a very quick decision. And so utilitarianism is oftentimes very effective. It also can be considered heroic, and we'll talk about that in just a sec, to self-sacrifice one person in order to save the many. But it gets complicated pretty quick. So for example, what if I think pain is good and pleasure is bad, like Puritans or religious flagellants? If you've seen the Da Vinci Code, right? There's the guy that whips himself because he believes that pain is inherently good to experience. That breaks down under this theory, right? It assumes that all human beings want pleasure and don't want pain. Additionally, it's impossible to foretell what the future, to know all the consequences of your actions. That's really difficult. So what if, in the train scenario, what if you pull the lever and all of a sudden 5 more people jump on the tracks and you end up killing 6 people, right? You can't always determine what the consequences of any action are going to be down the road. Additionally, information costs are high. So even if you can get the information necessary, it's very costly to try and get all of the facts. And sometimes you don't even have the time or resources to be able to do that. It also assumes that actions don't have any intrinsic worth. So there may be an action or two that you can think of that you would think, you know what, no matter what the consequences are, I would do this because I believe it's right. That's a deontological approach. And we'll talk about that on Thursday. But this assumes there's no such thing as that. There's no separating an action from its consequences. And you're only obligated to do those actions that will bring about good consequences. And so that can be an issue for a lot of people who believe that an action is right no matter what consequences come as a result. And then finally, it can also be used to justify benefiting the majority at the expense of the minority. So let me give just a brief example of that. Okay, so let's just look at the Marvel Cinematic Universe for just a second. Spoiler alert here. These movies have been out for a couple years, so hopefully I'm not spoiling this for anybody. If you're not wanting spoilers, then just skip to the next slide. But but these different scenes or characters in the movie show how utilitarianism is kind of a double-edged sword. On the one hand, it can be extremely heroic. On the other hand, it can be extremely villainous. So up on the top, you have two villains. So one so Thanos, his operating principle was, I can make 50% of the universe's population better off if I kill the other 50%. They're overpopulated. They're taking too many resources. So if I kill 50, just make them disappear, then the remaining 50% will be incredibly better off. You can see the utilitarian logic there, right? And the way that the other 50% that die have to do so they have to be the expense, so the other can be better off. And then on the left, you have Pierce. This is in Winter Soldier, where they have the technology to wipe people out before they commit crimes. And so he gives a specific phrase in there where he says, I can make 6 billion people better off by killing 20 million. He said, I'm happy to do that. So in his mind, he made that calculation saying, look, if I kill 20 million people, the rest of the 6 billion population is going to be so much better off. Now, let's flip down to the bottom and we have the heroic side of utilitarianism, right? Where you have Vision was willing to, in order for an attempt to destroy one of the Infinity Stones, was willing to die, right? They said it's going to kill you. And he says, it's better that I die so that everyone else, the 50% that had died, can return and live. And the same obviously goes for Iron Man. He ultimately does make the ultimate sacrifice. Better that I die so that everyone can be better off, right? That's a very heroic and inspiring thing to do. And it's a utilitarian calculation. So you can see here that it can be used for good and for ill. And so it becomes problematic in trying to make that calculus of, well, this may not hold under all situations. So under what situations is it heroic? And under what situations is it villainous? So in summary, remember that utilitarianism is consequentialist and it's teleological. It focuses on determining what is right based on the consequences of the outcome, and it focuses on ends, not means. Second, the principle of utility focuses on the greatest good for the greatest number of people. We want to maximize the greatest happiness, pleasure for the greatest number of people. Bentham was the first to really solidify this theory. He wanted to make it a quantitative calculation, quantitative experience, and he used hedonism to do that. So we weigh pain and pleasure, and we just try to maximize the pleasure and minimize the pain for as many people as possible. And then John Stuart Mills came in and added a qualitative aspect to this to show that humans experience different kinds of pleasure and that there are some pleasures that are better than others. And even no matter how much they were maximized, we still would want these higher pleasures, which he would call happiness. So that's our wrap up for utilitarianism. Again, on Thursday, we'll move into deontology, which is the separate branch of philosophy, and then we'll compare and contrast the two. Thanks.